Gustavo tapped his pen against the polished surface of his mahogany desk, the rhythmic sound echoing in the near-empty office. The expansive windows behind him framed the city skyline, glittering with the promise of wealth and ambition. Yet, tonight, the stillness unsettled him. Gustavo was a man who thrived on control over his company, his finances, and every intricate detail of his meticulously planned life. But control came at a cost, one he'd long stopped calculating. He leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes falling on the only light still on in the office, Clara's desk. She was always the last to leave, her dedication as quiet as her demeanor. Clara had been working for him for 6 months, a presence so unobtrusive that Gustavo often forgot she existed. She had a knack for fading into the background, her soft-spoken responses and unassuming nature blending seamlessly into the corporate machinery. Tonight, however, something felt different. As Gustavo stood to retrieve a file he had forgotten, he noticed her silhouette through the frosted glass of her office. Her head was bowed, her shoulders trembling. He hesitated, torn between his usual detachment and a growing sense of curiosity. Then her voice broke the silence, muffled and filled with raw emotion. "No, I don't have the money yet," she whispered harshly, her words laced with desperation. "I'm doing everything I can. Please, just give me more time." Gustavo froze, his hand on the doorknob. The word money hung in the air like a weight, pulling his thoughts in unexpected directions. For a man whose life revolved around finances and negotiations, hearing that single word in such a personal, pleading tone was jarring. He felt an unfamiliar pang, a mix of unease and intrigue. Was Clara in trouble? And why did it concern him? Steeling himself, he knocked softly and pushed the door open. Clara flinched, her eyes wide with shock and embarrassment as she hastily wiped her tears. "Mr. Andrade," she stammered, her voice strained, "I didn't realize you were still here." "I forgot some documents," he said, his tone neutral, though his gaze lingered on her tear-streaked face. "Are you all right?" Clara forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, of course. Just a long day." Gustavo didn't press further. He wasn't the kind of man who pried into personal matters, especially those of his employees. Yet, as he walked back to his office, her words replayed in his mind. The vulnerability in her voice, the desperation. It was a stark contrast to the composed, efficient assistant he knew. Something wasn't adding up. He sat at his desk, the file untouched. His mind, usually consumed by balance sheets and corporate strategies, now wandered into uncharted territory. Who was Clara outside of this office? What kind of struggles could push someone to the edge like that? He had built his empire on understanding people's motivations, yet hers remained a mystery. The city outside gleamed with the allure of opportunity, a constant reminder of his success. But for the first time, it felt hollow. He couldn't shake the image of Clara's trembling hands clutching her phone, her whispered pleas piercing through the armor of his indifference. It wasn't compassion. Gustavo wasn't naive enough to mistake it for that. It was curiosity, plain and simple, or so he told himself. As he shut off his office light, the lingering question remained. What would drive someone like Clara, so composed on the surface, to the brink of desperation? And why, out of all the problems he faced, did this one suddenly seem impossible to ignore? If this story has you intrigued, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel to uncover the mysteries and emotions that lie ahead. The echo of his footsteps down the marble corridor seemed louder than usual, a strange rhythm that mirrored Gustavo's unsettled thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of Clara's tear-streaked face, her trembling voice still lingering in his mind. The way she clutched her phone, as though her very existence depended on the words exchanged, was haunting. The next morning, Gustavo arrived at the office earlier than usual. The quiet hum of computers and the occasional rustle of papers greeted him as he passed through the pristine workspace. Clara was already at her desk, her posture as composed as ever, her eyes fixed on the monitor. To anyone else, she looked like the epitome of professionalism. But Gustavo knew better now, or at least he thought he did. "Clara," he called as he approached her desk, his voice even but probing. "Can you step into my office for a moment?" Her eyes flickered with unease, but she nodded and followed him inside. Once the door was closed, he motioned for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, studying her carefully. "I won't beat around the bush," he began. "Last night, I overheard part of your conversation. I'm not one to pry, but it sounded serious." Clara's expression shifted, part embarrassment, part defensiveness. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," she said softly. "It won't affect my work, I promise." "This isn't about your work," Gustavo replied. "It's about you. If you're in some kind of trouble—" "I'm not," she interrupted, her tone sharper than intended. She took a breath, composing herself. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Andrade, but it's personal. I'll handle it." Gustavo considered pressing further, but stopped himself. She had drawn a line, and for now he would respect it. Yet as she left his office, the unease only grew. He had spent years reading people, decoding their motivations and ambitions. Clara's resolve wasn't just admirable, it was impenetrable. And that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. Later that day, an opportunity to learn more presented itself in the form of a casual conversation. During a break, Gustavo overheard two colleagues discussing Clara in hushed tones. "She's been taking night shifts at that diner downtown," one of them said. "Can't imagine why. She already works here full-time." "Maybe she's saving up for something," the other suggested. "She's always so quiet. Hard to tell." The revelation was unexpected. Gustavo had assumed Clara's life outside the office mirrored her efficiency within it. Simple, straightforward, manageable. The idea that she worked another job, possibly out of necessity, painted an entirely different picture. That evening, instead of heading straight home, Gustavo found himself driving toward the part of the city where the diner was located. It was a far cry from the polished glass towers of his corporate world. The streets here were lined with flickering neon signs and aging buildings, their worn facades telling stories of resilience and survival. He parked across the street, his eyes scanning the modest diner. Through the window, he spotted Clara moving briskly between tables, her smile polite but strained. She looked different here, less composed, more human. Gustavo's chest tightened with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Compassion, curiosity, guilt. As he watched her interact with customers, his mind raced with questions. What could drive someone to work tirelessly at two jobs? Was it a matter of finances, or was there something deeper at play? And why did he care so much? When Clara stepped outside for a brief break, Gustavo instinctively slid lower in his seat, not wanting to be seen. She leaned against the wall, her posture weary, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though searching for answers in the fading light. She pulled out her phone and hesitated before dialing. "No, I'm still short," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "But I'll have the rest soon. I just need more time." Gustavo gripped the steering wheel, his mind churning with possibilities. Debt, family obligations, something worse. Every scenario seemed plausible, and each one tugged at his curiosity like a thread unraveling a tightly wound spool. As Clara ended the call and returned inside, Gustavo knew he was already too far invested. Whatever Clara was facing, it wasn't just her burden anymore, not in his mind. And though he couldn't yet justify his involvement, he couldn't ignore the pull to uncover the truth. What Clara didn't know What Gustavo barely understood himself was that this moment would mark the beginning of a series of choices neither of them could undo. The night of the charity gala arrived with its usual fanfare of sparkling gowns, tailored suits, and clinking champagne glasses. Gustavo stood near the entrance of the grand ballroom, his sharp navy tuxedo impeccably pressed, scanning the crowd with practiced ease. He was used to these events, a choreographed dance of wealth and influence where alliances were forged and reputations cemented. Normally, he treated these gatherings as little more than an extension of the office, a stage to secure deals and expand his network. But tonight, something, or rather, someone, distracted him. Clara's arrival was quiet, but impossible to ignore. She wore a simple black dress that clung to her frame with understated elegance. Her hair swept back in a way that revealed the sharp lines of her face. She seemed out of place, as though she had wandered into a world that wasn't her own. Gustavo noted the way her eyes flitted around the room, cautious and calculating, like someone bracing for impact. It was the first time he had seen her outside the rigid structure of the office, and the shift in context was jarring. Here, in the ambient glow of chandeliers and murmured conversations, Clara was no longer just his assistant. She was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, and that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. "Didn't expect to see you here," Gustavo said as he approached her. His tone was casual, but his eyes searched hers for a reaction. Clara offered a polite smile, her hands clutching a glass of sparkling water. "Ms. Alvarez asked me to assist with the silent auction. It's for a good cause, so I couldn't say no." He nodded, though his curiosity deepened. Clara's sense of obligation, her constant readiness to serve, seemed almost compulsive. Was it purely altruistic, or was there something more driving her? Something she wasn't saying? Their conversation was interrupted by a colleague, who quickly pulled Gustavo away for introductions. As the evening progressed, Gustavo kept Clara in his peripheral vision. He noticed the way she moved, always just on the edge of the crowd, her posture poised, but her expression distant. She was a spectator, not a participant, navigating this world of wealth and privilege with the grace of someone who knew she didn't belong. When the auction began, Clara stood near the display table, overseeing the bidding process. Gustavo drifted closer, using the guise of inspecting one of the items, a rare piece of artwork, to strike up another conversation. "Do you enjoy events like this?" he asked, his tone light. Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the auction sheet. "They're interesting. You get to see a lot of different sides of people." Gustavo raised an eyebrow. "And what sides have you seen tonight?" Her gaze flicked to his, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "I think people reveal the most about themselves when they think no one's watching." The comment lingered between them, heavier than he expected. Before he could respond, a man approached Clara, his presence instantly shifting her demeanor. Gustavo watched as her posture stiffened, her polite smile faltering for just a moment. "Clara," the man said, his voice low but insistent. "A word." She nodded, excusing herself and following the man toward a quieter corner of the room. Gustavo's curiosity flared as he observed their interaction. The man's gestures were sharp, his expression intense, while Clara seemed to shrink under his gaze. Their conversation was brief, but whatever was said left Clara visibly shaken. When she returned to her station, her composure was back in place, but Gustavo caught the slight tremble in her hand as she adjusted a display. He didn't approach her again that evening, but the encounter with the man played on a loop in his mind. Later, as the event wound down, Gustavo found himself replaying Clara's earlier words. "People reveal the most about themselves when they think no one's watching." It was an insight that felt both profound and deeply personal, as though she had been speaking about herself as much as anyone else. Driving home through the quiet streets, Gustavo's thoughts drifted to the man at the gala and the look in Clara's eyes when she spoke to him. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something close, a wary sort of submission. It gnawed at him, the sense that Clara was caught in something far beyond her control. For a man who had built his life around solving problems, Gustavo felt an unfamiliar frustration. He didn't have enough pieces to solve this puzzle yet, but one thing was clear. Clara's life was more complicated than he had imagined, and he wasn't ready to walk away from whatever it was she was hiding. The streets were alive with their usual chaos as Gustavo navigated through the city's less polished district. Neon signs buzzed faintly, their light casting an uneven glow over cracked sidewalks and weathered brick facades. This wasn't the part of town Gustavo frequented, but tonight he had a reason, a lead perhaps. He was searching for answers, and whether he wanted to admit it or not, his curiosity about Clara had grown into something more urgent. He parked his car discreetly on the corner and stepped out, the chilled night air carrying faint scents of exhaust and street food. Across the street was his destination, a small, dimly lit building with faded signage that read Tavernas Loans and Finance. The irony of its name wasn't lost on him. This wasn't the kind of financial institution Gustavo was accustomed to. Gustavo had followed a hunch, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations and small, unnoticed details Clara let slip. A name she mentioned in passing, a cryptic phone call, the man from the gala. They all pointed here to this dingy, unassuming establishment. He lingered near the entrance, his sharp suit standing out in stark contrast to his surroundings. Inside, the place was exactly what he had expected. A cramped office with mismatched furniture, walls yellowed by time, and a counter behind which sat a man whose demeanor screamed untrustworthy. The faint clatter of a TV in the corner added to the oppressive atmosphere. Gustavo had no intention of entering, not yet at least. He wanted to observe, to confirm what he suspected. As he waited, his attention was drawn to a figure approaching from the opposite side of the street. His chest tightened when he recognized her. Clara. Her pace was brisk, her posture tense. She carried an envelope in one hand, gripping it so tightly that the edges were crumpled. Gustavo moved back into the shadows, not wanting to be seen. His stomach churned as he watched her push open the door and step inside. For several long minutes, Gustavo stood frozen, his mind racing. He didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. Clara's body language spoke volumes when she reappeared. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and her steps were heavier as she exited the building. She paused on the sidewalk, looking down at her empty hands before shoving them into her coat pockets. Gustavo's instinct was to call out to her, to close the distance and demand answers, but he didn't. Instead, he followed her at a safe distance, his heart pounding as she turned down a side street toward a small apartment complex. She disappeared inside, leaving Gustavo alone under a flickering street lamp. Later that night, back in his penthouse, Gustavo stared out at the sprawling city, his reflection a ghostly outline against the glass. The weight of what he had seen pressed down on him. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Clara was caught in something serious, and whatever it was, it had to do with money, and not the kind that came with contracts and balance sheets. The memory of the envelope burned in his mind. He knew the look of desperation, the air of someone drowning under financial burdens. Clara's debt wasn't just a number on a ledger, it was a noose tightening around her life. The question that gnawed at him now was simple, yet maddening. Why? By morning, Gustavo had made a decision. He couldn't sit idly by and let this unravel on its own. Clara's guarded demeanor, her refusal to ask for help, it didn't matter. Whatever she was hiding, whatever weight she was carrying, he was going to uncover it. He told himself it was about fairness, about not letting someone under his employ falter. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was about her. At the office, Clara's usual efficiency was back in full force, as though the events of the previous night hadn't happened. Gustavo watched her closely, his gaze lingering on the faint shadows under her eyes and the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her desk when she thought no one was looking. "Clara," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the workspace, "I need you to come with me." Her head snapped up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Where to?" "It's a business matter," he replied, his tone giving no room for argument. "We'll be back by the afternoon." As they left the office and descended into the underground parking garage, Clara's unease was palpable. She glanced at him occasionally, her brow furrowed in quiet suspicion. Gustavo didn't explain as he started the car, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. The drive was long and quiet, the city's towering skyscrapers giving way to smaller buildings and, eventually, open roads. Clara finally broke the silence. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," Gustavo said simply, keeping his eyes on the road. When they finally arrived at a modest cafe on the edge of town, Clara's confusion deepened. Gustavo gestured for her to follow him inside, where they took a secluded table in the corner. The waitress brought coffee without being asked, and Gustavo stirred his cup absently before finally speaking. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I know you're in trouble." Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I don't need to know everything," he continued, "but I need to know enough to help you. Because whatever this is," he gestured vaguely, "you can't handle it alone." Clara's lips parted, as though she were about to protest, but no words came. For the first time, she looked small, vulnerable, and utterly human. Gustavo waited, giving her the space to speak, but her silence only deepened the mystery. Gustavo couldn't shake the memory of Clara's silence at the cafe. Her reluctance to share her burden felt less like resistance and more like fear, an emotion he recognized all too well from his own battles in the ruthless world of business. But this wasn't about boardrooms or balance sheets. This was something deeper, more personal, and far more dangerous. The days that followed passed with an undercurrent of tension. Clara resumed her usual efficiency at the office, her professional mask firmly in place. Yet Gustavo noticed the cracks, her distant gaze during meetings, the way her hands occasionally trembled as she typed, the faint exhaustion etched into her features. These weren't just signs of overwork, they were symptoms of someone fighting a war no one else could see. It wasn't until the end of the week that the facade faltered completely. The office was nearly empty, most employees having left for the weekend. Gustavo had stayed behind to finalize a major deal with a European client. He was reviewing contracts when the faint sound of voices caught his attention. At first, he dismissed it, assuming it was one of the cleaning staff. But as the voices grew louder, more heated, he realized something was wrong. Stepping into the hallway, he followed the sound to a small conference room. The door was ajar, and through the crack, he saw Clara. She wasn't alone. A man stood opposite her, his back to Gustavo, his stance aggressive. Clara was visibly shaken, her arms crossed defensively as she tried to maintain her composure. "I told you I don't have it yet," she said, her voice tight with frustration and fear. "I need more time." "You've had enough time," the man growled. "This isn't a charity, Clara. You don't pay, there are consequences." Gustavo's blood ran cold. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, each more unsettling than the last. Clara wasn't just in debt, she was being threatened. The calm, composed assistant he thought he knew was tangled in a web of danger, and her world was unraveling before his eyes. Pushing the door open fully, Gustavo stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. The man turned, his expression shifting from anger to wariness. Clara's eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. "Is there a problem here?" Gustavo asked, his tone icy. The man hesitated, glancing between Gustavo and Clara. "This is none of your business." "It is now," Gustavo replied, stepping closer. His height and unwavering gaze made it clear he wasn't intimidated. "Who are you? And what do you want with my employee?" Clara intervened, her voice shaking. "Mr. Andrade, please, this is—" "Answer the question," Gustavo cut her off, his focus locked on the man. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Finally, the man muttered something about a personal matter and stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Gustavo turned to Clara, his expression a mix of anger and concern. "Who was that?" he demanded. Clara sank into a chair, her composure crumbling. "He's a collector," she admitted quietly. "I owe money, more than I can pay back. He works for the people I borrowed from." Gustavo's jaw tightened. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was another matter entirely. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked, his voice softer now. Clara shook her head. "I didn't think it was your problem to solve, and honestly, I didn't want you to know. It's humiliating." The vulnerability in her words cut through Gustavo's frustration. He sat down across from her, leaning forward. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "This isn't just about money anymore. These people are dangerous. If they're sending collectors to threaten you at work, it's only going to get worse." Clara looked down, her fingers twisting together. "I know. But what choice do I have? The debt isn't even mine. It was my father's. When he passed, it became my responsibility, and now it's out of control." The weight of her confession settled heavily between them. Gustavo had seen his share of financial disasters, but this was different. This wasn't a bad investment or a failed business venture. This was a personal debt, inherited and compounded by circumstances Clara had no control over. "I'm going to help you," Gustavo said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. Clara looked up, startled. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," he replied, "but I am. You don't deserve to face this alone." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable, a shared understanding passing between them. Gustavo didn't know exactly how he would fix this, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let Clara fight this battle by herself. As they left the office together, the city lights stretched out before them, a glittering maze of possibility and peril. Gustavo couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the true scope of Clara's troubles had yet to reveal itself. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he was determined to see it through, no matter where it led. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of Gustavo's office, casting long shadows across the sleek, modern furniture. He stood by the window, sipping his coffee and staring at the city below. The conversation with Clara from the night before lingered in his mind. Her story had unraveled something in him, an impulse he couldn't ignore, a determination to fix what was broken. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from a private investigator he had hired that morning, someone he trusted implicitly. The message was brief but revealing. The loan sharks Clara is involved with are part of a larger network. They're known for predatory practices and violence against debtors who can't pay. Gustavo's grip on the phone tightened. This was far worse than he had anticipated. He called Clara into his office shortly after. She entered cautiously, her eyes scanning his expression for clues. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Andrade?" "Close the door," he said. His tone was calm, but there was a weight behind his words that made her hesitate before obeying. Once the door clicked shut, he gestured for her to sit. "Clara, I need to know everything," he began. "Every detail about this debt, how it started, how much you owe, and who these people are." Her shoulders tensed, and she shook her head. "I already told you, it's my responsibility. I'll figure it out." "You're not figuring it out, Clara," Gustavo replied, his voice sharper than he intended. He softened his tone, leaning forward. These people aren't just going to go away. They don't care about fairness or decency. They care about money, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it. Clara exhaled shakily, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It started 2 years ago, she admitted. After my father passed away. He had taken out a loan to cover medical bills, but the terms were impossible. When he couldn't pay, they started coming after me. At first it was manageable, but the interest, it's like it never stops growing. Gustavo listened intently, his jaw tightening with each word. How much do you owe now? Her voice dropped to a whisper. Almost 70,000. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. Gustavo ran a hand through his hair, the enormity of the situation sinking in. And what happens if you don't pay? They've threatened to take everything, Clara said, her voice trembling. My apartment, my car. And if that's not enough? She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Gustavo sat back, his mind racing. He had dealt with high-stakes negotiations and ruthless competitors, but this was different. This was personal, and it wasn't just about money. It was about survival. I've already started looking into this, he said after a moment. These people operate outside the law. They use fear to control their debtors, but they're not untouchable. Clara's eyes widened. What do you mean? I mean, there are ways to deal with them, Gustavo said firmly, but it's going to take more than money. These people need to be held accountable, and you need to be free of them. Clara shook her head, panic flickering in her eyes. You can't get involved, Gustavo. It's dangerous. That's not your decision to make, he replied, his tone brooking no argument. You're my employee, Clara. More than that, you're someone I care about. I'm not going to stand by and watch you be destroyed. For a moment, Clara looked as though she might protest, but the weight of her exhaustion won out. She nodded, her voice barely audible. Thank you. Gustavo didn't reply. He simply stood, walking to the window and gazing out at the city again. His reflection stared back at him, a stark reminder of the man he had become, calculating, relentless, always in control. But for the first time in years, he felt something stir beneath the surface, a purpose that wasn't tied to profit margins or shareholder expectations. As Clara left the office, Gustavo's resolve hardened. He would do whatever it took to free her from this nightmare, even if it meant stepping into the shadows himself. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle ahead would demand everything he had. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Clara face it alone. The meeting took place in a dimly lit restaurant tucked away in the city's industrial district. It was the kind of place where whispered conversations carried more weight than loud declarations. Gustavo sat at a corner table, his posture relaxed, but his mind alert. Across from him was Victor, an old friend from his college days who had made a name for himself, not in finance, but in navigating the city's darker corners. Victor leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes studying Gustavo. You don't usually call me for favors, he said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. What's this about? I need information, Gustavo replied, his tone measured. There's a loan shark network operating in this city. They're targeting someone I know. I want to know who runs it and how to shut it down. Victor raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Since when do you get involved in things like this? You're a corporate guy, not a vigilante. Gustavo didn't flinch. Let's just say this one's personal. Victor's expression grew serious. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You're talking about the Cartwright Syndicate. They're not just loan sharks, they're parasites. They thrive on fear and desperation, and they're good at covering their tracks. Going up against them isn't a small task. I'm not looking for a fight, Gustavo said. I'm looking for leverage. Victor nodded slowly, considering. They have a leader, Nathan Cartwright. He's smart, ruthless, and paranoid, But like any operation, his has weak spots. People who work for him aren't loyal, they're just scared. You find the right one, and they'll talk. "How do I find him?" Gustavo pressed. Victor scribbled something on a napkin and slid it across the table. "There's a guy named Marcus. He's low level, but he knows enough to be useful. You'll find him at this address most nights. Just tread carefully. You don't want to attract the wrong kind of attention." Gustavo pocketed the napkin, his resolve firm. "Thanks, Victor. Just don't get yourself killed," Victor replied with a chuckle. "You're not exactly built for this world." As Gustavo left the restaurant, the city's cold air bit at his skin, but his focus remained unshaken. He wasn't built for this world, as Victor had said, but he was no stranger to risk. The stakes were higher now, and failure wasn't an option. The address led him to a dive bar on the edge of town, a place where the lighting was dim and the clientele was anything but welcoming. Gustavo walked in, his tailored suit drawing a few curious glances. He spotted Marcus almost immediately, a wiry man with a nervous energy, seated at the bar nursing a cheap beer. Gustavo approached, his presence commanding attention. "Marcus?" The man froze, his gaze darting to Gustavo. "Who's asking?" "Someone who can make it worth your while," Gustavo replied, sliding a folded bill onto the counter. "But only if you give me what I need." Marcus hesitated, glancing around the room before snatching the money. "What do you want?" "Information on Nathan Cartwright," Gustavo said. "I know you work for him. I also know you'd rather not. Tell me what I need to know, and I'll make sure you're taken care of." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You're messing with fire. Cartwright doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget." "And neither do I," Gustavo said coldly. "Now talk." Marcus sighed, his resistance crumbling under Gustavo's steady gaze. "Cartwright runs everything from his estate outside the city. Security's tight, but he's got a routine. Every Friday, he meets his top people at a private club downtown. That's your best shot at getting close." Gustavo nodded, filing the information away. "Anything else?" "Yeah," Marcus said, leaning in. "Don't trust anyone. Cartwright has eyes everywhere." Satisfied, Gustavo left the bar, his mind racing with the next steps. The path ahead was risky, but it was clear. He would infiltrate Cartwright's circle, find the leverage he needed, and dismantle the threat hanging over Clara's life. Back at the office the next day, Clara noticed something different about Gustavo. His usual controlled demeanor now carried a sharp edge, a quiet intensity that made her uneasy. "Is everything all right?" she asked hesitantly. Gustavo paused, meeting her gaze. "Everything's under control," he said, the double meaning not lost on him. Clara's brow furrowed, but she didn't press further. Still, as she returned to her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Gustavo was doing, it was bigger than she realized. Gustavo, meanwhile, prepared for what lay ahead. He wasn't just fighting a battle for Clara's freedom. He was stepping into a world he had spent his life avoiding, armed only with determination and the willingness to do whatever it took to protect her. Gustavo adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit as he approached the opulent private club. The neon-lit streets outside were a sharp contrast to the world he was stepping into, one of exclusivity, power, and unspoken rules. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. The soft hum of low conversations and the clink of glasses set the tone for a night where appearances masked intentions. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes quickly landing on Nathan Cartwright. The man was everything Gustavo had expected, polished yet predatory, his smile as sharp as the tailored edges of his charcoal suit. Surrounded by a group of sycophants, Cartwright sat in a private booth, his laughter carrying across the room like the sound of a trap being set. Gustavo approached the bar, ordering a drink he had no intention of finishing. He needed to play this smart, blending in while observing. His target wasn't Cartwright himself, not yet. First, he had to identify the cracks in the man's armor. The weakest link in his circle was often the most valuable. After an hour of careful observation, Gustavo's attention settled on a man named Victor Delgado, a mid-level associate with a loose tongue and an apparent fondness for the club's well-stocked bar. Delgado's laughter grew louder with each drink, his bravado inflating in tandem with his inebriation. He was perfect. Gustavo bided his time, waiting until Delgado drifted away from the group to the quieter confines of the club's cigar lounge. There, Gustavo made his move. "You looked like you were about to burst from boredom over there," Gustavo said, his tone light but engaging as he approached Delgado. "Mind if I join you?" Delgado glanced up, his gaze hazy but intrigued. "Suit yourself," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. Gustavo sat, offering a practiced smile. Nathan Cartwright's crowd can be exhausting. All talk, no action. Delgado chuckled, lighting a cigar with unsteady hands. "You've got that right. They act like they run the world, but half of them wouldn't survive a day outside their little bubble." Gustavo leaned forward, feigning camaraderie. "Sounds like you've got the real stories. What's it like working with Cartwright?" Delgado hesitated for a moment, his instinct to guard his words, battling with the alcohol loosening his tongue. "It's complicated," he said finally. "The man's a genius, sure, but ruthless. You don't get second chances with him." "That's what I've heard," Gustavo said, his tone casual but probing. "What's the secret to staying in his good graces?" Delgado smirked, taking a long drag of his cigar. "Loyalty, or at least the illusion of it. You give him what he wants and he'll keep you around. Fail and—" He trailed off, his expression darkening. "And?" Gustavo pressed gently. Delgado's gaze flicked around the room, as though checking for unseen eyes. "Let's just say Cartwright doesn't let debts go unpaid." Gustavo nodded, filing away the information. "Must be hard keeping up with his expectations, especially with the kind of business he's in." Delgado's laugh was bitter this time. "You have no idea. The man's got his hands in everything, loans, real estate, even offshore accounts. The money's always moving, always growing, but it's never enough for him." Gustavo's pulse quickened. This was what he needed. A glimpse into the financial web Cartwright had woven and a potential thread to unravel it. But Delgado wasn't finished. His Achilles heel, though. Delgado leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He trusts too much in his own invincibility. There's a file, documents he keeps on everyone he's ever worked with. Names, numbers, leverage. It's his insurance policy, but if that got out..." Gustavo's mind raced. A file like that was the key. If he could get his hands on it, he could dismantle Cartwright's operation and free Clara from her debt. But it wouldn't be easy. "Where does he keep it?" Gustavo asked, keeping his tone neutral. Delgado leaned back, puffing on his cigar with a sly smile. "You think I'd know? I'm not high enough on the ladder for that. But I've heard rumors. Somewhere close to him. Always close." Before Gustavo could press further, a shadow loomed over their table. Cartwright himself stood there, his piercing gaze locking onto Delgado. "Victor," Cartwright said smoothly, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You seem to be enjoying yourself." Delgado froze, his expression shifting to one of panic. "Just catching up with an old friend," he stammered. Cartwright's gaze flicked to Gustavo, assessing him with the precision of a predator. "And you are?" Gustavo stood, extending a hand with practiced ease. "Gustavo Andrade. I've been looking to expand my portfolio and I've heard a lot about you." Cartwright's smile returned, though it remained as sharp as ever. He shook Gustavo's hand, his grip firm. "Well, Mr. Andrade, I hope what you've heard is good." "Nothing but the best," Gustavo replied, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Cartwright held his gaze for a moment longer, before turning back to Delgado. "Let's talk, Victor, privately." Delgado paled, but followed Cartwright without a word, leaving Gustavo alone. As the two disappeared into the shadows of the club, Gustavo exhaled, his mind racing. He had the lead he needed, but now the stakes were higher than ever. Cartwright had noticed him, and in this world, attention was as dangerous as a loaded gun. As Gustavo left the club, his thoughts turned to Clara. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was darker and more perilous than he had imagined. And yet, despite the risks, he was more determined than ever to see this through. The tension was palpable as Gustavo parked his car a safe distance from Cartwright's sprawling estate. Hidden behind high walls and thick iron gates, the property exuded the kind of wealth that came with unchecked power. It was nearly midnight, and the moon cast a pale glow over the manicured grounds. Gustavo's pulse quickened as he adjusted his jacket, the weight of the small USB drive in his pocket a constant reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. The file Delgado had mentioned, the so-called insurance policy, was the linchpin of Cartwright's entire operation. If Gustavo could find it, he could dismantle the empire that had kept Clara and countless others in its grip. But breaking into the fortress of a man as paranoid as Nathan Cartwright was a gamble that required precision and no small amount of nerve. He slipped through a side entrance in the wall, a gap he'd discovered after hours of reconnaissance. The estate was eerily quiet, the only sounds the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of security cameras sweeping their fields of view. Gustavo moved quickly but cautiously, his steps muffled by the soft earth beneath him. The main house loomed ahead, a monolithic structure of glass and stone. Gustavo knew the file wouldn't be in plain sight. It would be somewhere close to Cartwright, just as Delgado had said. His study was the most likely candidate, a room Gustavo had glimpsed during his visit to the club when Cartwright's personal guard had inadvertently dropped a hint about the boss's routines. Slipping through a side door, Gustavo found himself in a narrow hallway, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. He moved carefully, avoiding the creaky floorboards he had noted during his previous reconnaissance. The study was just ahead, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was everything Gustavo had imagined, a blend of luxury and menace. The walls were lined with bookshelves that housed more than just literature, files, ledgers, and binders filled with secrets that could topple empires. At the center of the room was a massive mahogany desk, its surface cluttered with papers, a laptop, and a sleek steel safe. Gustavo crossed the room quickly, his eyes scanning the desk for anything that might indicate the safe's code. Cartwright was meticulous, but even the most careful people had habits they didn't realize. Gustavo's gaze fell on a framed photo, a rare personal touch in an otherwise sterile environment. The photo showed Cartwright with an older man Gustavo recognized as his late father. The date engraved on the frame was unmistakable, Cartwright's birth year. It was a gamble, but Gustavo had no choice. He keyed the numbers into the safe's digital lock, his breath hitching as the mechanism clicked open. Inside, a stack of documents and a small encrypted hard drive gleamed under the dim light. Gustavo grabbed both, slipping them into his jacket pocket just as the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. His heart raced as he ducked behind the desk, his breath shallow. The door creaked open, and Cartwright's unmistakable voice filled the room. "I don't care what it takes," he barked into his phone. "If Delgado's been talking, I want him dealt with. Quietly." Gustavo's stomach churned. Delgado's life was on the line because of what he had revealed. The stakes were no longer just financial, they were life and death. Cartwright moved toward the desk, his footsteps unnervingly slow. Gustavo pressed himself closer to the floor, every muscle in his body tensed. Cartwright paused, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Make sure no one ever thinks about crossing me again." The sound of a lighter flicking broke the silence, followed by the acrid scent of a cigar. Cartwright turned and walked back toward the door, his conversation continuing as he exited the room. Gustavo waited until the echo of his footsteps faded before slipping out of his hiding spot, his chest heaving with relief. The escape was just as tense as the entry. Gustavo navigated the labyrinth of hallways and corridors, avoiding the sporadic patrols of Cartwright's guards. When he finally reached the perimeter of the estate, he slipped through the gap in the wall and sprinted to his car, the adrenaline in his veins propelling him forward. Back in the safety of his penthouse, Gustavo locked the door and immediately retrieved the documents and hard drive. His hands trembled as he connected the drive to his laptop, bypassing the encryption with a code Delgado had provided in hushed whispers. The contents were staggering, detailed accounts of every transaction, every threat, every name tied to Cartwright's network. It wasn't just leverage, it was a blueprint for taking down the entire operation. Gustavo leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The information was enough to free Clara, but it came with a cost. Exposing Cartwright would unleash chaos, and Gustavo knew the man wouldn't go down without a fight. He was playing with fire, and the consequences could burn everyone involved. As dawn broke, Gustavo stared at the city skyline, the hard drive still in his hands. The battle was far from over, but for the first time he had the upper hand. He wasn't just fighting for Clara anymore, he was fighting for everyone trapped in Cartwright's web of power and fear. And the war had only just begun. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city as Gustavo parked his car in front of Clara's modest apartment building. In his hand was the hard drive containing the key to dismantling Cartwright's empire. His jaw tightened as he replayed the events of the past few days, the infiltration, the near miss with Cartwright, and the realization that the stakes were far greater than he had imagined. Now it was time to act. Clara greeted him at the door, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Gustavo, what are you doing here? We need to talk," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The weight of the hard drive in his pocket felt heavier than ever. He gestured for her to sit, and as she did, he placed the drive on the small coffee table between them. "This," he began, his voice steady but serious, "is everything Cartwright doesn't want the world to see. It's a record of every deal, every threat, every person he's manipulated." Clara's eyes widened, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "How did you get this?" "It doesn't matter," Gustavo replied. "What matters is what we do with it. This is enough to take him down, to free you and everyone else trapped in his web, but it won't come without risks." Clara looked at him, her gaze filled with a mix of fear and hope. "If this gets out, he'll come after you, after us." "I know," Gustavo said, his voice softening, "but we can't let fear stop us. People like Cartwright thrive because no one stands up to them. This is our chance to change that." For a long moment, Clara was silent, her eyes fixed on the hard drive. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "What do we need to do?" The plan unfolded over the next few hours. Gustavo contacted a trusted journalist, someone with a reputation for exposing corruption and a network capable of protecting sensitive sources. Arrangements were made to deliver the information anonymously, ensuring that no one could trace it back to Gustavo or Clara. As night fell, Gustavo and Clara sat in his car outside the journalist's office, the hard drive nestled safely in a secure envelope. The air between them was thick with anticipation and nerves. "You don't have to do this," Clara said quietly, her voice trembling. "Yes, I do," Gustavo replied, turning to face her. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about stopping a man who's been destroying lives for years. And it's about proving that people like him don't always win." Clara reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you for everything." Their eyes met, and in that moment the connection between them deepened. This wasn't just about duty or morality. It was about trust, loyalty, and something neither of them had expected to find. The next morning, the story broke. Headlines across major news outlets exposed Cartwright's empire in brutal detail, the hard drive's contents providing irrefutable evidence of his crimes. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Authorities launched investigations, and Cartwright's allies began to turn on him in a desperate bid to save themselves. Gustavo watched the chaos unfold from his office, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages from colleagues, associates, and even competitors. He ignored them all, his focus solely on the television screen broadcasting Cartwright's arrest in real time. Across the city, Clara sat in her small apartment, tears streaming down her face as she watched the same footage. For the first time in years, the weight on her shoulders began to lift. She was free, not just from the debt, but from the fear that had consumed her life. Later that evening, Gustavo and Clara met in a quiet park on the edge of the city. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the city seemed distant as they sat on a bench overlooking the water. "It's over," Clara said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "For now," Gustavo replied, "Cartwright's gone, but there will always be others like him. What matters is that we stood up to him, and we won." Clara smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that Gustavo realized he had never seen before. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You didn't have to," Gustavo said, his tone gentle. "That's the point. You don't have to face anything alone anymore." As the city lights twinkled in the distance, Gustavo realized something he hadn't expected when this all began. Clara had changed him. Her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering determination had reminded him of what truly mattered. In helping her find freedom, he had found a new purpose for himself. If you've been captivated by this journey of resilience, courage, and the triumph of humanity over greed, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that inspire and move you. Every story has a lesson, and we'd love to hear what this one meant to you.